What is up, guys? Lord Nick here, bringing you another One Piece related video. I do apologize. This is going to feel probably a little rushed because I've recorded this twice and realized there were some errors in the making of this video, but I'm trying to get this video made and prepared so that I can release it on Friday so that we can, as I have promised, folks. So before we jump into the video itself, guys, hey, for those that don't know, we have a Discord now for the Rebecca mains. It will be listed in the description down below. We have a couple of guys. So far, we've had one guy that has volunteered to help moderate and, kind of build up the Discord and help me kind of get a lot of the integrations in there. So bear with us as we're building it up, but it will be a Discord for us to be able to share the flowing of ideas for Rebecca, talk about it and kind of discuss. And then on top of that, helping the newer players and those that don't really understand how to utilize Rebecca to the fullest to become more competitive if they wish to do so. So let's jump into it though, guys. So first up, guys, this video is, well, I guess actually I should tell you what this video is, outside of those that are probably reading it. This is going to be the best OP08 cards for Rebecca. So these are the curated best 5 that I've put on here. Honestly, I don't, outside of the top 2, I don't think I've really rated the other ones in strong contention, other than that the number 5 card I think is just objectively the worst of them, but it is about the only card that I could think of for 5. I could have done a top 4, probably dropped the other card, and it would have been fine. But there are also some deck lists at the end, so let's jump into it, guys. So number 5, Edward Weevil. We're not going to go really depth into this card, but statistically speaking, it's not a bad card. On curve, it's not terrible. It is a 4-drop 5k that is also a 1k counter, so it's not a dead card in hand. Now, this card with Dawn times 1, when attacking, return up to one of your one character with a cost 3 or less to its owner's hand. So this can be utilized on your own characters, to put one of your characters back into your hand to be able to get an on-play effect from them later. For 1 Dawn, this is a easy way of being able to get a Kyros back into your hand so you could do some KO stuff. It is kind of cool shenanigans in that regard. On top of that, it can also get rid of a 3 cost off of your opponent's field back to their hand. That's a tempo play on its own, which is pretty good. We've already utilized cards like this back in like OP04, OP05, where we used the 4-drop ulti, or 3-drop ulti that is a 4k power, does similar effect, except it did it with 2 costs, and it allowed you to select to put to hand or bottom of deck. So this card doesn't have as much versatility or utility as that card, but this card does have just straight up a 3-cost card that it can get rid of or bounce in regards of, utilizing it for your own value. And I think that is particularly useful, and I could see myself using this as a 1 of 2 of tech. I think it is much more falling into the tech category, but I think it is actually kind of a unique and interesting kind of card for that factor. The fact that it does hit 3s, and it's such an affordable card to get out there. And it's not a big enough threat that your opponent really wants to get rid of it, but it becomes enough of a nuisance with some of our cost reduction that it can actually get rid of some big boys and get around like KO stuff as well. For just 1, if you could do Dawn minus, a cost -1 on a Borsalino. Borsalino is now in range to be popped back to their hand, and that can be very nuisancey for a lot of black decks. Whereas something like a Rosinante 2-drop blocker is going to be in range for this card in green every single time. So ultimately, I think this card is kind of neat and could be niche. And the fact that it bounces to hand for both players means that you can bounce stuff that on your own side back to your hand and be able to utilize it opposed to bottom decking. So I think that is kind of a neat kind of thing, but like I said, there are other cards that already do this. This is just kind of the best card that I could think of out of the cards that we had selection curated for specifically for Rebecca. Now, number 4, I think this is a much more playable card. We're talking about Who's Who. Who's Who is just, honestly, I think a better Kaku. There's an arguable debate here, but let's get into the card itself, kind of talk about the stats and the ability of the card. The card itself is a 5-drop 5k attacker, so ultimately it is 1k less than the Kaku that I'm comparing it to, but it is a 2k counter opposed to a no counter. So that on its own is already really, really powerful. Or Kaku might be a 1k actually, if I'm thinking about it. Anyhow, they're both CP cards. That's also why I'm comparing them. CP9 cards, technically speaking. Josou, on play, trash card from your hand, KO up to one of your opponent's 3 costs or less. So it has the exact same KO ability as Kaku, but its cost is different. Instead of after bottom decking 2 CP cards, you have to trash a card from your hand. Ultimately, I think that is a stronger card than Kaku, just due to the fact that its cost is a lot easier to get off. It's a lot more beneficial, and it actually puts cards into your trash, which a lot of black decks need to do, whereas bottom decking, there's just a couple of cards out there that already do that, so you don't really need more bottom decking options. Ultimately, I think this enters into the realm as one of the best CP cards, as well as a really good Animal Kingdom Pirates card. But then outside of its main ability, you have a trigger effect that does the same thing as main, KO with 3 cost or less. So ultimately, this card also offers us a trigger outside of its own character, which means that this has a lot more versatility. It's a 2k counter. It has a decent statted body. It's within range of both Rebecca and Mon Cherie. And ultimately, I think this card is just a very valuable potential card to be slotting in as a 2 to 4 of. Do I think that this needs to be in your Rebecca deck? No, I don't think this enters the territory of like needs to be heavily considered, but it is a really neat tool, and I would not bat an eye about putting it into a couple of lists. Actually, one of the lists later does have it in there. Ultimately, I think this is a very solid card, and thus why it kind of hits the number 4 spot. Is this kind of the first actual playable card of the set, like legitimately so. Number 3 is Kaido. Kaido is another boss monster that we now have access to for black. It is the black version of Mihawk, by the way. If you just didn't know what this card does, it is black version of Mihawk, and it is slightly better than Mihawk. So whereas Mihawk does bottom deck of things, so that's virtually always gone, Kaido trashes a 7 cost, so they both hit the same cost. They're both 9 drop 9Ks, so that's why I'm comparing it there. They are basically the same card, like I said. They both hit the same character cost. But the biggest difference here, Kaido does have a cost to his. His is also an activate main. So it's an activate main once per turn. As long you may trash a card from your hand. If this character was played on this turn, trash up to one of your opponent's characters with cost 7 or less, then your opponent trashes 1 card from their hand. So it's upgrading Mihawk, because even though it has an additional cost where Mihawk does not, that additional cost is not necessarily bad. It could get a brick out of our hand and put it into our trash and be a reusable brick later when we actually need it. Or on top of that, it also trashes a card from our opponent's hand, so our opponent loses a resource in the same time. So we are now doing a 1-for-1 twice. So it is a 2-for-2 card, which is a very valuable thing. We don't get a lot of those. Now note, a lot of people I've noticed have been talking about, okay, does it just mean that the KO ability or the trash ability doesn't happen after the first turn and then the other one does? No. After the first turn, if you trash a card, you're just trashing a card from your hand. It does nothing else. There is no like, oh, then your opponent trashes a card here. To my understanding, the entirety of the ability is just you get all of it or none of it. And you can pay 1 to trash if you really wanted to, which can also somewhat be useful in Dressrosa to an odd degree. Because it can just fill up for free. It just gives you a card into your trash, which means if you're running Luffy in the same list, you could potentially just get your Luffy online now, or your Kong gun online. It's kind of an interesting aspect. I don't think it needs to be utilized that way, but it is a 9 drop 9k, so it is a difficult to remove body. It's a really big beat stick, and it removes basically anything in the game with any of our cost reduction in our deck. So ultimately, I think this is a very valuable card. It has a lot of potential. I personally probably won't be using it all that much, but I can definitely see why it could be used, and in future sets, it could end up becoming super valuable and super needed against a lot of different matchups. So I'd still recommend getting it. Number 2 is Jack. So this is ultimately the best black card in the set, and the biggest part of it is that first ability. This character gains +4 cost. So what this means is you play it for 7, and while it is on the field, it has +4 additional cost, which makes it an 11 cost, which means this card is damn near impossible to remove from removal cards, exception being something like Red Rock that removes anything. Now, its ability also makes this card stupid good. So, statistically speaking, this card is good. It's a 7-drop 8k, which is just good aggressive stat line. It's not overstated, but it's better than just a generic, generally a card with an ability. It does not have any counter, so it is technically a brick, but it also says, you activate main, you may rest this character. Draw 1 card, trash 1 card from your hands, then KO up to one of your opponent's characters with cost 3 or less. This card is insanely powerful. It is insanely sticky. It is very difficult to remove, and even when you rest it, swinging into an 8k is not necessarily the play that a lot of people want to do. So until super late, this card is probably going to stick around for a while. And yes, you can be like, well, green can just keep it locked. Yeah, that is true. Green can keep it locked, but ultimately, outside of that type of scenario, it is an anti-black card that does the things that black wants it to do. It filters your hand. This card just does everything. It is the utility all in one. And then once you don't need to remove stuff, it's just an 8k beat stick, which is just super, super, super good. I think this card will be a problem card. I think this card is legitimately worse for the health of the game than Gecko Moria. A lot of people can argue argues that Gecko Moria is not healthy for the game, and I honestly believe that this card will be even less healthy for the game, because even the decks that like to run removal will have difficulties dealing with this card. The exception being yellow, who has Rygo or Kingdom Come, depending what you call it, and blue, who has Red Rocks. So because of this card, those cards might see a higher priority, which means that certain other characters might become more valuable. But if this card is so prevalent that we see a giant increase in those cards, this card might not be as good. But until then, without forcing that, this card is insane. Oh, skipped a card. And number 1, I think this is the singular best card in the set for Rebecca, and that is 6-drop Josou. Now, a lot of you might be like, what, Josou? How did this card become the top card in my opinion? How is this the best card? Well, let me kind of run it down for you. Josou is a 6-drop 7k. Hey, we like that stat line. That's why we're running Hajiruden, is that stat line is really good. He's a 1k counter, just like Hajiruden. Now, unlike Hajiruden, he doesn't reduce cost on something, but what he does is, on play, you may return one of your characters other than this character to your hand. Cool, so that seems like a bad cost, because now we're losing tempo, right? Kind of. Now, you can bounce a Kyros to your hand. Let's say we bounce Kyros to our hand. Let's just theoretically bounce Kyros to our hand. What is the return this character gives us, outside of a decent statted body? Well, return up to one character with a cost 6 or less to your opponent's hand. That's pretty dang good. I'm not going to lie, I really love that ability. I think this card is insanely valuable. He's a solid piece of removal that does not require any cost reduction. That is a mid-game card, which gives us another 6 Dawn turn card that, in a situation when we are actually behind and can't afford to put a Hajiruden out, we can just put a Josou out, and the Josou will remove something in the process of it, and bounces one of our characters to our hand, and potentially opens up more removal for us the following turn. So ultimately, I think this card has very limited downside. Now note, the downside would be is if we play him and we can't use the on-play effect because there's nothing else to bounce. But we have enough low-cost cards. We have enough cards like Kyros, like Brook, like a lot of bouncing a Rebecca to our hand's not the end of the world either. Like, if we don't need the blocker and we just need to start developing bodies that are then removing bodies from them, bouncing a Rebecca blocker back to our hand isn't a bad thing either, because guess what? She gets to use her value all over again. This card has a lot of value. I think this card is super playable. This card is going to be a card I am testing with and have been testing with, and I think is ultimately my favorite card coming out of the set for Rebecca. Now, let's take a look at example deck list number 1. So this deck list right now is essentially the deck list that I am currently running. There are a couple of small key changes. 1, we took out the Colosseums completely. The reason I did this was to fit in space for Josous. I think ultimately running 1, maybe 2 Colosseums isn't that bad of an idea, but without the Luffys, we also needed something that bottom decks more than just the Moncheries. A lot of people have complained in the past that we end up getting into a situation where the Moncheries aren't very useful because of that. So ultimately what I decided was that we needed to rob Lucci's, so we took out the 2 Leos, put in 2 Lucci's, and so I wanted to keep our non-counters roughly the same. We have the 3 Josus in. Currently, it still has Gravity Blade in the list. I think with the inclusion of Josus and Jax, Gravity Blades may not be as necessary, or maybe not as a 3 of at least. But I think there's arguable case that maybe we could remove Gravity Blades entirely. We could add back in a Colosseum or 2, probably about 2 Colosseums. And then we can turn the 3rd Gravity Blade into something with more counter on it, be it another 2k, maybe Who's Who, something like that. Ultimately, this is kind of an example list. This deck list will be listed below. I found that this list, in my testing, is what has made me love Josou. I really, really like him. I don't know necessarily if I would say this list is like on par with how I feel about my current list, but I definitely am going to try to find the space for Josou, so we will be evolving it as we get into OP08. The evolution will be happening. And it'll probably be an experimentation. Now, like I said, Jack is kind of on the fence. He is as a 2 of here, like our Luffy is currently at a 2 of. I think Jack can be considered the better option, but like I said, if we see a lot more Kingdom Comes being played by all the yellow decks, if we see every blue deck is now teching 3 to 4 red rocks, Jax may not be the option. He just may not be the option just because, like, the value he has is the fact that he's almost impossible to get off the board. And if that's the case, then I'd much rather have the Luffy threat of getting 2 things gone, the potential of getting 2 things from Luffy opposed to the guaranteed 1 thing that Jack gives. Because if I'm trading 1 for 1, it's not ideal. But if I'm trading 2 for 1, well, 3 for 1 technically with the Luffy, right? Jack is pretty good, right? Because like I play him, I remove one of your characters, and then you use a card later to remove him. That's 2 cards that you've used, basically 2 cards for my 1. That's not bad. Whereas Luffy, if I get rid of 2 of your characters and you still use a red rock to bottom him, you've now used 3 cards to remove. You've lost 3 cards to my 1 card. So ultimately, Luffy has the potential to be higher powered, and if that is the case, that we see a lot of stuff that's just good at removing Jack, then I think the upside of having the chance of Luffy popping off like that is there. And if they don't have the ability to remove him, well, Luffy's a bigger threat at their life than Jack is, even with him being such a hard to remove card. So this is deck list number 1. This is more or less the same list that I run, like I said, with just a bit of spices in there, with it, which is the Jacks and the Josus, and taking out the Colosseums completely. Now, if we look at the next one, I took out even more things from the deck. If you can tell, there are no Kiroses. I didn't put in, I still have the 2 Rob Luccis, and instead we have 2 Borsalinos to kind of round things out. We've moved it up to 3 Jacks, and we've added in 2 Kaidos and an extra Josu. On top of that, we've replaced the Orlumbus package that we were running with 4 Who's Who's and an additional patchwork. So this one has about 17 bricks in it, but outside of that, it actually has 12 2Ks in it because we've added in the Who's Who's, and it still maintains the same number of removal cards in general, and actually has some that are slightly higher. But because we're running the Who's Who's, we have a way of getting rid of some of these bricks. He's also another 2K we can get back Rebecca. Ultimately, I think this list actually has some merit to it and might actually be a list that I will test out more thoroughly. And honestly could be the Rebecca list. But, you know, I'm so used to some of the older cards that I've used with Rebecca that it's kind of weird not seeing my Kuzans. Now, note, our Josus don't get as much value with this list because the cards we are bouncing back are going to be Brooks, going to be Rob Lucci's, they're going to be Rebecca's, maybe. Maybe we get to Moncherie off on an 8 Dawn turn. We play Moncherie, use Moncherie, get back a 2K, then Josu bounces Moncherie to hand bounce one of their characters. That can be a pretty powerful turn, ultimately, but we'll have to see. We'll have to test it out. Like I said, this is kind of more. This is a very top-heavy and greedy list, whereas the other one I think is a little bit more balanced, has a little bit about early game and more or less what Rebecca wants to do. And as I said before, this isn't the optimal list for either. We're going to be doing a lot more testing, but I wanted to give you guys kind of ideas and examples of what I'm doing with the list. Both will be listed below. Now, guys, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you're looking forward to in this next set. And until the next time, guys, I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye, guys.